Welcome to Easy Peasy Books, From Author to Authority, the lively and engaging podcast for business professionals who've always believed they have a book in them. I'm your host, Gillian Whitney. Join me as I chat with authors and industry experts from all around the world to explore simple strategies to write, publish, and leverage your business book. Whether you're an entrepreneur, executive, or an employee, this podcast is for you. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Easy Peasy Books podcast. Today, I want to talk about something that comes up a lot with people who are thinking about writing a book. And it's the idea that somehow you've missed your window, that you've waited too long and time has passed you by. And I just want to say right up front, the answer is no, just no. It is never too late to write your book. Now, I know I've touched on this topic before, but I don't think I've really kind of taken that deeper dive to get into this full conversation, which I really think it deserves. So that's what I want to do today. And I'm going to share a couple of stories that are actually pretty close to my heart because I think maybe one of them at least might hit home for you. So let's start off with thinking about how technically you could write a book at the age of 18 or 20 or 25. Nothing is stopping you from writing a book when you're that young. But here's the thing. At that age, have you really got wisdom to share? Have you really lived enough of your story to know what you actually want to say? I think there's something to be said for waiting, which is why I don't think any of us should beat ourselves up for taking a long time to write our book. I tell everybody it took me 21 years to write my first book, but then once I did that, it was like making up for lost time. I have been hitting the Amazon shelves ever since. Now I've done 6 books. So I think there's actually something to be said for waiting, because waiting is actually a good idea, because perhaps those books have just been simmering. I like to think about it like how you bake bread. You don't just mix up all the ingredients together and then jam it into the oven. Instead, you have to add some of the ingredients in certain stages. In the beginning, maybe you just take water and sugar and the yeast, and then it has to proof. Then you have to add the flour and the oil and all the other stuff, and then the bread has to rise. And if you rush the process, you're going to end up with a loaf of bread that nobody wants to eat. And I actually did that several times in my bread baking history. I remember once I was making bread and I think I was like doing Zoom calls at the same time. I think I was talking with my sister and somehow I missed an ingredient. I forgot the salt. I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And I didn't notice it. And I spent hours making this bread for Friday night. I was making challah. And then it looked beautiful. It rose, it did all the things, and I baked it and it was gorgeous. And I did the egg wash and it was shiny and it was gorgeous. And we sat down for dinner and everybody was just like eating the bread going, "What did you do, Mom?" It was awful. It was awful. Nobody could eat the bread because I'd forgotten the salt. So ingredients matter and you can't rush it. So the same thing can happen with a book. If you rush to write the first idea that pops into your head, is that book actually going to stand the test of time? Is that book going to reflect everything that you've learned, everything that you've lived through, everything that you know? I think it's much better to take your time and really be thoughtful about what you want to write. Because when you write a business book, you have to think of it as you're planting a flag. You're saying, this is what I know. This is my expertise. This is my advice to the world. And you want to make sure that your flag is planted in exactly the right spot. And that takes time because that takes living. Now, I want to tell you about my mother. My mother had stories. Oh, so many stories. And she really lived a wonderful, rich, fascinating life with all these stories. Just amazing. And she was a child in London during the Blitz, and she used to tell us stories of being in the underground with her gas mask on and making little farting noises and all sorts of crazy things. My mother emigrated to Canada with 2 small children. I wasn't born yet, and ended up being divorced in a country where she was living now in Canada with no family, no support, nothing. And she literally had to teach herself how to drive a car and, get a job and all sorts of different things. And then as an adult, when I was an adult, my mother actually, I was still a kid, my mother flew when I was 13 years old. My mother flew to Israel for a vacation on the eve of the Yom Kippur War. And she actually arrived in England. She was visiting her dad at the time. War broke out. And she contacted the airport and said, "Well, what happens now?" And they said, "We'll give you a refund." And she said, "I don't want a refund. I saved up to go to Israel. This is my vacation." So my mother actually went on the plane. She gets on the plane. It's full of all these soldiers that are like on leave. Now they're all coming back and journalists. So she's sitting on the plane beside this woman, and this woman turns to her and says, "What paper do you write for?" My mother said, "I'm a tourist from Canada." And the woman was like, "What?" And she got up and she said, "Hey, everybody, we've got a tourist on the plane." And everybody started clapping. My mother ended up being in Israel for 2 months. She went all over the place. That's the kind of fascinating life that my mother had. And for years, I encouraged my mother to write all these stories down about her childhood, her adulthood, everything in between. I thought she should capture them. She just had so many great stories, but she never, ever did. She wouldn't allow me to tape her. She wouldn't allow me to write those stories down. She kept saying, "I'll do it someday," but she never did. And here's what's sad. My mother has passed on now, and those stories that she told are already fading from my memory. As I get older, I'm forgetting the stories that she told. And guess what? I'm not passing those stories on to the next generation. And so essentially, bit by bit, all the details are just going to disappear. And then one day, they'll be completely gone. And so that's what happens when we don't write it down. It's a slow disappearance of something that can never, ever be replaced. Now, let me tell you about my dad because his story is a lot different. My dad decided he was going to write a book, not a book for Amazon, not a book for the world. He wanted to just write a book for our family. My dad wanted to capture our family history. He wanted to get it clear of how did we all come to live in America because nobody was born here except for our kids. But my sisters were born in England, my parents were born in England, I was born in Canada, and my dad thought we need to say, how did our family get to America? He wanted people to know who we were and where we came from. So with my dad, his audience was just his 3 daughters, his grandchildren, his nieces and nephew, and then all the generations that would come after us. And let me tell you, my dad worked really hard on this book. He was like a scholar. He spent probably 2, 3, 4 years researching, thinking about what are the different family stories he wanted to capture because it wasn't just him, it was also the stories of his parents and everything else that he had, sort of those treasure troves that you keep in like a suitcase somewhere. And he went through letters and he collected his thoughts and he decided what should be in the book and what should be left out. He even included photographs. My dad took this very seriously because he was an engineer. So engineers are all about the details. And when he finally got done writing everything, he said, "I don't want this to just be a Word document. I don't want this to just be a PDF. I want this to be a real physical book, a book that somebody could hold in their hands." So he came to Devin and I and asked us, "What can you do to help me make this happen?" And Devin was assigned to be the proofreader, which I point out was something that my father would not let me do, which was crazy because I was the tech writer. But my dad said, I need to have somebody totally unbiased. And actually, he was right because I was reading it over Devin's shoulder and I would look at some things and I'd say, "That's not how it happened." And Devin would say, "Jillian, it's not your book. When you write your book, you get to say your version of the truth. This is your dad's book, so you've got to let it go." And I did let it go. Well, eventually, except I still want to say on record when he talked about me being in a parade for Wizard of Oz when I was living in Michigan, I was not a rat. I was not a mouse. I was actually the cowardly lion. So I just want that on record. So, anyways, within 2 weeks of holding the finished book in his hand, because we actually then took the proofread version, we went to a printer, we had, I think, about 10 copies made, hardback. Like, my dad didn't even want a paperback, he wanted it hardback and bound. And once we got that copy to my dad passed away 2 months later. And it was like, wow, he was only in his 80s, but you know what? It felt like he lived long enough to do what he wanted to do. He got his story out into the world, and I'd like to think my dad felt complete and that every word in that book was exactly the way he wanted it to be. Now think about that in contrast with my mother. Same generation, same parents, my mom and my dad, same rich, rich life, but a completely different outcome. So now I want to talk to you about Devin's grandmother, and I love this story so much. So Grandma T, which is what we called her, Grandma Tannenholz, Grandma T was a traveler. She loved to go all over the world. She went on cruises and she went on tours and she was always going somewhere. I think she's been to every continent, so many countries. It's just crazy. And she was a real adventurer. She would go off and do all these different trips. And when she got to about the age of, maybe 90, somebody in her synagogue offered to document all of her travels. Just somebody who had listened to her over the years, tell stories when she was talking, said, you need to gather these stories. You need to write them down and get these memories, in a permanent way. And this woman offered to help Grandma T. And they worked on it for probably a good year or two. And they worked together to gather Grandma T's stories, her photographs, her memories. They went through her letters. Grandma T had so much fun working on this book. And eventually it was printed, self-publishing, independently published, whatever. Didn't ever get on Amazon, but it became a paperback and it was awesome. And she made enough copies for all of us to have this. And it was wonderful because here now was a record of somebody who had really shown up for her own life. And she would have this forever for future generations. Now, here's the thing I love the most. Grandma T's book was finished when she was in her early 90s. And she went on to live to 102. We actually went to her 100th birthday. It was huge. It was a great success. And that means that Grandma T had about 10 years of knowing that her stories were safe. She didn't have to worry about, losing her memory. She didn't have to worry about anything. Everything was there. And she would love going through her own book. She loved rereading her own stories and looking at the photographs. And she loved that it was a gift to us. And so many times she'd come over to visit and she'd say, "Do you remember I have a book?" And I'd be like, "Yes." And I'd pull it off the shelf and tell her, "Yes, I have a book. I have a book." So, what I want you to think about is if you're sitting there thinking that you might have left it too late to write a book, I want you to remember Devin's grandmother at 90, she wrote her book. So, think about that. But here, let's change things up a bit. My dad's family history and Grandma T's traveling adventures, Those are treasured books, absolutely. But their audience was small and private. A business book is something else entirely. When you write a business book, you're not writing for the people in your family. You're actually writing for strangers, people you'll never meet, people that live in other countries, people that are on other time zones that are waking up in the middle of the night. Maybe they need your book because they're trying to help solve a problem that they have. So, your words, your experiences, those hard won lessons could be exactly what somebody else needs to hear. They don't need to hear it from some famous guru. You don't need to hear it from somebody with fancy credentials. They need to hear it from you. They need to hear the things that you know from the path that you took, told in your voice. And here's, to me, what's exciting about that there's actually a domino effect. Somebody reads your book, and that could shift the way that they think about something. And then they use that shift in their own work, with their own relationships, with their own clients. And then, boom, their clients are changed. And that people that are working with their clients, it's going to be changed, and so on and so on and so on. Think of it as like dropping a pebble in the water and it just keeps rippling out in waves. And you may never see or never even know all the different people that your book could impact. So, yes, I want you to realize your book could do that. The expertise that's sitting inside your head right now that you have spent decades accumulating, this could do that for somebody else, but only if you write it down. I want to leave you with this thought. There is nobody else on the planet that has your exact combination of experience, perspective, and insight. Nobody has lived your professional life. Nobody has worked with your clients, made your mistakes, and figured out what you figured out in exactly the same way that you have. So the question is not whether it's too late. The question is whether the world actually gets to benefit from what you know. My mother's stories are fading. My dad's family history and Grandma T's adventures are well preserved for future generations. And somewhere out there, a coach or a consultant with 30 or 40, maybe even 50 years of incredible experience is still telling themselves they're going to get to this someday. Someday they'll write that book. I don't want that to be you. Now is exactly the right time. You have the wisdom. You have the stories. You have decades of clients with lives that you've changed. The world is waiting for what only you know. So now, go write it. And if you're feeling stuck and you're not sure where to begin, that's what I'm here for. Head over to easypeasybooks.com and schedule a discovery call with me, and we'll figure this out together. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I'll be back here next week with another episode of Easy Peasy Books. And until then, please remember, it's never, ever too late. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Easy Peasy Books, from author to authority. If you found value in today's episode, I'd be grateful if you could leave us a review. It helps other aspiring authors discover our podcast. To learn more about writing, publishing, and leveraging your business book, visit my website at easypeasybooks.com.